Hello and welcome to Coffee with the Captain, and today I'm going to be joined with a gentleman I've known for some time named Mike Pierce, and otherwise known as Antarctic Mike. And Mike is a speaker and a bunch of other things, and he's got some really cool programs that are about to come out. So Mike, go ahead and say hi to everybody.
Hello everybody, thanks for taking a few minutes.
Yeah, we're going to have a quick little interview here. And so the big burning, number one, Coffee of the Captain, you got your mug, right? Ahoy, matey.
Cheers.
welcome. So I just, the whole Antarctic Mike thing, I know quite a bit about it. And for those of the folks that are watching this that don't know about it, why don't you explain real quick what you did or how that all started for you?
Well, I've been a big fan of Antarctic history for more than a decade. And the reason I became a fan was because I found that the stories from many of these expeditions had a lot of lessons that could teach people things in the real world today. And so I started reading about these stories, collecting pictures, videos, and reading about many of these expeditions, and then started using them in a leadership program that I was paid to teach by a corporation that I used to work for many years ago. So I found that these stories became a better way to make the points of the course. I didn't change the points of the course, I just changed the way that they were illustrated and driven home with the stories. And so it became sort of a hit within my company. And that's when I decided, well, I've got to take this to 3,000 companies, but how am I going to do that? So I had to figure out how I was actually going to make this a business, because it's very different. Just because I have material and a course doesn't mean I have a business. And so I had to figure out how I was going to make it a business. Well, I ended up going to Antarctica twice. In fact, it was about 11 years ago coming up was my first of two trips. And I went there to run a marathon, and then a year later I ran an ultra marathon, which is longer than a marathon. And the reason I did so, again, was to sort of get a taste of what my heroes 100 years ago tasted down there in those conditions. And so that's why I did what I did.
So you just recently went and did another marathon down there?
No, it's been 11 years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't realize
I
you
took
went down
two trips
twice.
in the same year of 2006. I took two trips.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. And so Ernest Shackleton is one of those heroes, right?
Correct. He's one of several, yes.
Yeah. And I use him. Ironically, before you and I met, I was using him while I was training emotional intelligence, because he's such an emotionally intelligent leader. And that's what I'm really drawn to. And being a former sea captain, it was it was just interesting when I heard that you were talking about him, that it already kind of sparked my interest because he was such a great leader.
I'm curious, being in your background as a sea captain, have you been down in the Southern Ocean in those waters?
No, love to go
You
there.
haven't?
No.
I know a lot of people who race boats around the world, pilot ships and all that like you did, and a lot of them have told me they wouldn't take a boat down there. Do you feel the same way? I'm just curious.
It is what it is. I mean, if you're on a good boat and you trust your boat, it's just like preparation for anything. If you feel really secure on your boat, then you'll survive the storms. I
can't imagine what it's like though in 40 and 50 foot waves.
Yeah.
Have you been in size waves like that?
I've been in 30 plus foot waves, 1,500 miles offshore, and I just did a talk yesterday on that, and I was telling the audience that you're there. You have to weather it out, and you have to, a lot of things start happening.
Wow.
What's really interesting for me,
they were so primitive.
Yeah.
100 years ago, relative to what we have today, I would think that the safety factor had to have been significantly compromised 100 years ago, just due to the fact that things have gotten so much better. But
oh yeah, without a doubt. Just looking at the photos that if you Google the Shackleton expeditions, I mean, it's mind-boggling what they did and what they had, but they're totally prepared.
Right, they were.
Yeah. So it's all about preparedness, right?
So
Yeah, and that's a great metaphor for life, because if we're not doing that, then we go off half cocked in anything we do. And I know you're all about preparation. So why don't you tell me a little bit about that? Because I know your occupation was you were a headhunter for corporations.
Yeah, I was a people thief for many years. That was my
People thief.
profession.
Yeah.
And I found though that yes, a company has a big and expensive problem if they can't find people, but they have a bigger and a more expensive problem if they can't keep those people.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say keep them, what I really mean is making sure people are engaged. Statistically speaking, between 20 and 25% of the workforce today is fully engaged on a consistent basis. 20 to 25%, that's not very good. And when you look at the reasons as to why that's the case, I mean, it ought to make the average leader's head spin, because most of these factors that cause this are either fully or highly within the control of leaders. In other words, they keep fumbling the same football over and over and over. I mean, it's almost pathetic, but it's reality. And so the points from these stories, these expedition stories, I use them to illustrate these particular items that leaders or managers can do more of or less of. In other words, factors they have control over, to help the probability increase significantly that the people on their team will be more engaged every day.
Right, and ironically, I was talking to this gentleman last night at a holiday party. He's a manager, and he said that they're having a real problem with, and I hate to use the word millennials, but that's the phrase that's been coined to
Right.
label this segment of our population.
Right.
And he said they're playing video games at this particular company. These guys play video games. It's a tech company, and they're calling in sick for work because they stay up to 3 or 4 o'clock playing video games. So it's a whole different breed of cat. So do you, have you experienced that when you're in those numbers you're talking about, the 25 to 40% of being engaged?
Well, I think when it comes to different generations of people, there are certain inherent needs that human beings have, no matter what generation they came from. And so I think that a lot of times leaders today use the word millennials as an excuse,
right,
and as a reason as to why they can't help these people. And I think that while the problem may be more challenging or more difficult, that doesn't mean you can't get those people engaged. I know plenty of people who are 20, 22, 25 years old. They're very engaged in what they do, and they're very diligent in the work. So I don't think it's fair to say that just because somebody was born into a particular time segment of the population, that I can pigeonhole all of those people and label them and say, well, they have no chance because they're a millennial. I think that's an excuse, personally.
right. Yeah,
I just think if I'm a
agree.
leader and I'm responsible for these people, the way I take care of these people has to be different than the way I've taken care of other people.
Yeah, and ironically, the guy I was talking to is 36, so he's not much older than that segment of
He's
population.
kind of in that boat, yeah.
So he's engaged. He's a leader. So on that note, then, so your training, and I just want to share this with people because it's pretty incredible. If they go to your website, it's magically appearing right below you as I speak. It just happens that way. I don't know how it happens. Every time I say that, it ends up. So his website's right below him, right there. So you can point down at it. Go ahead and point. There you go. But you actually spent time. If they go to your website, they can see the film that you spent time in a freezer preparing to go down to do this marathon.
I did. It was a commercial freezer here in San Diego.
Yeah.
It was
And that's
great.
all about preparedness, but you're like on a spin bike in this video, right?
Yeah, I was on a spin bike and I ran. There were a number of different films. I'm not sure exactly what you're alluding to. There were several news films that came in and shot video, and sometimes I'd be running, sometimes I'd be on the bike. I just mixed up the different types of activity I did in the freezer because I spent so much time in there.
Mm-hmm.
The freezer, interestingly enough, you'd think the value of the freezer would be to acclimate to the cold. And clearly, while that was partially what it accomplished, the real value of the freezer was in building the mental muscles. Because you see, the biggest challenge of the freezer isn't the fact that it was 22 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. The real challenge was that I only had 59 feet from one end to the other to work with. So it was like going back and forth between frozen metal walls that were only 59 feet apart. And here I am training for a 26-mile run, and then the next year for a 62-mile run in a 59-foot space. And learning to overcome the monotony and the difficulty of that was the biggest value of the freezer and building all the muscles up here. Mm-hmm. And the muscles up here are the most important muscle in the body of any human being, not just an athlete. And so the transference of this point of the freezer to the real world was so obvious. I mean, it just hit me when I was in the freezer. I mean, I learned so many lessons while I was doing this. I didn't know in advance that I would stumble across these points, so to speak. But I did in hindsight, and then I'm like, wow, this is a gold mine of metaphors and points that real people in the real world, people who are not runners and who are not going into cold weather can clearly benefit from.
Right. And so when you came out of that freezer, you live in Encinitas, right?
I do.
Yeah, so it's just San Diego County, and it's always like in the 70s there. So when you came out of that freezer, what was that like?
Oh, man, some of the days in the freezer, I mean, I was in the freezer for 2 years. So, I mean, especially during the summer, I mean, down there in Miramar where the freezer was, the outside air temperature often would be 90, 95 degrees. And with the sun just baking down, And, I mean, you go from minus 22, and of course you're sweating. Right. So you're soaking wet, you're frozen. And when you come outside the loading dock door, yes, in one way it's kind of a relief, only because your body kind of warms up to normal temperature. Yeah. For me, I liked it better in the freezer. I just happen to like cold weather. I mean, my wife and I were talking about this today. She said, you have some kind of internal heater that most people don't have, and I probably do. I mean, you noticed right now around the United States, it's been pretty cold, especially in the northern plains. And I have friends who live in Saskatchewan and in Manitoba and in Alberta, central Canada. And it was really cold in central Canada. Yesterday it was 26 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit in Saskatchewan. And I've been there when it's been that cold, and it made me miss it. I see those news stories and I go, I got to turn the news off because I don't want to see this.
That's interesting because a buddy of mine took me to a Tony Robbins event. I'd never been to one, and they had a gentleman there named by the name of Wim Hof, and you should check him out if you haven't seen him, but he's called the Iceman.
I've heard of this guy. Yeah,
pretty incredible guy, but he's got a breathing technique that they're studying, like 6 universities are studying him because he can control his body temperature.
That's incredible.
And he loves it in the cold. I mean, the guy dives underwater underneath ice. He'll chop a hole in the ice. Who does that? Maybe you do. You ought to go meet Wim Hof.
I'm sure I'm sure somebody like that, yes, part of that's mental, but part of that is also physically, he's got some characteristics that the average person obviously doesn't have.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and probably a little bit crazy.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
People like he and I are different. Our minds are wired differently. I get that.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you, excuse me, I have something in my eye there. I just interviewed Gary Maxwell 2 interviews ago, and Gary's a friend of yours, and you guys have a project coming up. I wanted to promote that a little bit on this call because I know there will be some friends of mine that are speakers that will be watching this. So tell us a little bit about what that program's about.
Gary became a very good friend of mine about 3 or 4 years ago. He, at the time, lived in New Brunswick, which is just east of the state of Maine. And I happened to be I was going to New Brunswick. In fact, it was about 3 years ago, almost to the day. I was in New Brunswick in the fall, a few years ago, speaking. And I knew he lived there. So I said, hey, listen, while I'm in town, I don't know how close you live to where I'm going to be, but I'd like to meet you. So he drove on out. It was about an hour drive from his house. He drove on out, met me, and heard me speak. And we became very good friends. And one of the things that we noticed about a year ago, he'd call me and he would say, hey, listen, I'm getting a lot of inquiries from people in our business who haven't really established themselves. And they're asking questions about how do I build this business and what do I do? I know you're successful and can you help me and teach me and that kind of thing. And I said, gee, it's funny you mentioned that because I get a lot of the same things. And so we said, listen, why don't we put some things together online that can help people? And so we decided to do this probably, we started talking about this, I'd say probably a year ago. And then we ended up, he moved to London, Ontario, which is about an hour from Toronto. And the reason he moved was so that he'd have more accessibility in the United States, because getting into the US from New Brunswick is really difficult. Whereas from Toronto or Detroit, it's an easy entry. He's about a 90-minute drive to Detroit or an hour from Toronto, so he can easily get in the US. And so I was speaking in Toronto anyway. This was about 4 or 5 months ago. And he said, listen, I have a friend who has a video studio. We can rent it for a fairly reasonable price. Let's go in there and put some of this content on video that we can help speakers with, people who want to build a speaking business. So I did that, and we ended up creating this 6-part video series that takes people from how you find an audience to the content to getting referrals. I mean, all the building blocks it takes to actually turn a speaker into somebody who can actually build a business, because the art of building a business is different than the art of building a great speech. Mm-hmm. But building a great speech, ironically enough, is part of building a great business. You can't have a great business without a great speech. But just because you have a great speech doesn't mean you have a great business. So we put all this stuff together on video, and we've come up with some really good things that will really shortcut the time curve. I mean, I just remember back when I started, I didn't have any video tutorial. I didn't have any help whatsoever. And it was trial and error. I mean, I created this message and I had this story, and then I'm like, well, what do I do now? How do you actually get business? Because to get business is the name of the game.
Right.
And so he and I put together a whole bunch of things on video and it's all story-based. It's all stuff we did right, stuff we did wrong, examples. And I wished I had that back when I started 10 years ago.
Oh, believe me.
It saved me an enormous amount of time.
Yeah. It's and as you know, my speaking career, I'm getting some pretty good traction now, but it's been a while. I mean, it's taken time to do that, and getting past the gatekeepers and how you do that, the process of there's so many speakers now.
There's a lot of choices customers have, but even more so than that, I don't worry about how many speakers there are out there, because I know this, that most of the business that I have comes from somebody who heard me and then spoke up to somebody else. Mm-hmm. Because if you think about it, if you hear me, if you're in the audience and you hear me speak and you like what you hear, and then somebody who's a peer of yours calls you or talks to you in a conversation and says, hey, my company's having an event, and who did you guys get to come in and speak? And you say, well, we got several people, and one of them is this guy, Mike. I heard him firsthand. When that guy calls me, he's already halfway sold on me, even though he's never met me, because of the strength of the relationship he has with you. And so that's really where the bulk of your business should come from. Your program, the experience that your customers have should be so good that whenever there's a conversation about an event and a speaker coming in, your name can't not come to the top of their mind. I mean, it really should be that good. Yeah. And that's where you have to give an experience. If you give an experience to people that is just second to none, that's exactly the reaction that's going to happen. And that's exactly what will happen in your case. And a lot of speakers don't get that. And I'll tell you why. Most of them don't deliver an experience that is really so emotionally engaging that people can't not remember it. The other thing I'll say is this, and this is kind of a word of caution to speakers. I was at an event in Chicago about 2 weeks ago, and a couple of the people in my audience were longtime members of this particular network where I was speaking. I mean, they've been in this network for more than 30 years, and they've seen hundreds and thousands of people like me and you. And they said, listen, we've been a part of this network for decades. We've seen hundreds of people like you and all that. And the guy said to me, Mike, what I just experienced, your program that we just concluded, he said it was one of the best I've seen in 35 years. And I said to him, well, listen, I'm flattered, but why did you say that? And here's exactly what he said. He said, Mike, the reason I say that is because you didn't pitch anything, meaning try and sell something from the stage. Mm-hmm. And I kind of looked at him, and my instinct, and I didn't say this to him, but my instinctive thought in my head was, well, of course I didn't. Like, why would I do that? He said, you'd be shocked how many people like you will do this. He said, and it just irks people to no end.
Yeah.
Right? And so the important lesson is there's a right way to sell what you do, and there's a wrong way. And clearly, this guy was making it very apparent what the wrong way is. And, I look back on, if I look back at a video of everything I've spoken on in the last 10 years, it's very fair to say that I don't even have a hint of selling anything or asking. In fact, I tell people one of the things I do is when I get near the end of my stories is I put a logo up of all the social media sites that I'm on, and I say, listen, here's the only thing I'm going to ask you for. Just send me an invite. If you like what you hear, I'd appreciate you writing a testimonial. If you don't want to write one, that's fine. But if you really like what you heard, I would appreciate, a recommendation. And I just put up the logos of social media sites. And I say, just look up Antarctic Mike. I'm on all these sites. I say, that's it. That's all I ask for. I literally don't ask for anything. And I don't even have a hint of it. And I think that becomes very attractive to people because the old saying is true. People like to buy, but they don't like to be sold to.
Right.
And in our business, it's just as true as it is the person walking on the car dealer lot who just wants to buy a car, but they don't want to be assaulted and sold to.
There's another saying that a confused mind will always say no.
Boy, isn't that the truth?
Yeah.
And when you start pitching people, that's a great way to confuse them, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a right way to do it, and there's a wrong way to do it.
Well, great. So there's a call on the 4th, and I'll go ahead and put that information up too, that people can call in to hear more about this, right?
Oh, yeah, we're going to have all kinds of stuff for people. I don't have an exact time. It's probably going to be, best guesstimate is probably 9 a.m. Pacific time, 12 noon Eastern time is probably my guess.
Okay.
Because it will go live across all the time zones.
Well, let me, I'll get that information from you. This is going to come out Monday morning early. So
okay.
I'll definitely have a message on there how to find out more about that and all that good stuff. So
thanks.
We're about the point now where people start kind of like doing other things after. So I thank you so much for coming on here. I know it's very short notice, and you're a team player and a leader. And I just did my talk yesterday. I talked about, and there's the missus.
I'm sorry, I have to admit, I listened to some of this, so I apologize.
Mrs. Antarctic.
Mrs. Antarctic. That's
Yeah.
fine.
Okay.
No, glad to meet you. I just did a talk yesterday. I talked about the old saying about eagles. It's hard to soar like an eagle when you're hanging around turkeys. And so to meet you and Gary has been a real treat for me, and I look forward to meeting you someday soon.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on.
Okay, Mike. Have a great night.
All right.
Bye-bye.